So as you know, we have this experience, the boarding school stories experience. This is a national traveling exhibit from the Hurd Museum out of Arizona, and it's traveling all around the United States. This is the only venue in the Northern Great Plains that's hosting this exhibit. So let your friends know it's here through May 25th. After the Western Heritage Center, we pack it up. We're going to be closed for a week just to repack the exhibit. It goes to Van Nuys, California, and then Greenville, South Carolina. So it takes some time to go through, read, to listen to the narrative. So we're open till 5 if you feel really ambitious today. So today our speaker, Yufna Soldier Wolf, is doing a program, Boarding School Survivors Experience and Repatriations-Breaking the Silence. Yufna Soldier Wolf was born and raised on the Wind River Reservation in central Wyoming and is a citizen of the Northern Arapaho tribe. Yufna's parents were both boarding school survivors. Her grandparents were the first generation to be sent to the Carlisle Industrial School in Pennsylvania. Soldier Wolf's extensive research examines her genealogy and history of the American people, of the Arapaho people, and the research began at Montana State University. Is that Billings or?
Billings. Yeah.
Billings, okay. She explores the memories of relatives visiting, talking, and crying about their boarding school traumas and experiences. The lecturer will share the experience of healing and moving forward as a tribal people. We're grateful she came up today, so thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for being here. Before I get started in my PowerPoint, I kind of want to make sure I'm okay moving around because I usually move around a lot. Is it okay if I just stay in this general area? Yeah. Okay, great. So dos besi ne te ena nanana hanana e na te nanana hanana e ni si hina. What I said was, hello everybody, my name is Arapaho Tough. My name is Yufna Soldier Wolf. I'm an Arapaho woman. I have, as pointed out earlier, I came to school here in MSU. I actually came here after graduating from high school and then not really being pushed into the area of college. My parents were, I'm the youngest of 10, and so I was kind of being pushed in the area of like, okay, just stay home, learn your culture, you know, learn how to bead and sew, which was great. And one of the things was really just figuring out, like, what do I want to do with my life? I went to a Job Corps and I learned how to be a stucco mason. I came here to Billings and I built some of the buildings here. One of the things I did while I was here was use that money to send myself to school. Actually, my cousin showed up one time and was like, come on, we're going to Billings. And I was like, okay. I had a lamp and I had like $20 and like 2 duffel bags of clothes, and I moved here. I went to school. I registered myself first at Rocky Mountain College, and then I registered to MSU. And I liked MSU because their basement is a huge library. It's a huge, huge library. And growing up, my dad was a historian. His name was Mark Soldier Wolf. And being the youngest of 10, I was always with him. People used to think my parents were my grandparents. And so growing up, education was not this huge thing for us, right? Our boarding school that they went to was like 3 miles from where we live. These are my children, Blue Moccasins and Martin. They actually go to the school I went to, that my parents went to, that their parents went to, my grandparents. It's called St. Stephen's Mission. It's outside of Riverton, Wyoming, and it's been there for a very long time. It's a Catholic mission. So as I went to school here, I graduated in 2005. I transferred, I finished here and I graduated and I went to the University of Wyoming. I went to school I went to the University of Wyoming for anthropology, archaeology, minor environmental natural resources. I went back and got my Indigenous Studies degree. And then I went to Norman, Oklahoma and got my Indigenous Peoples degree, which is basically federal Indian law. One of the things about that was in between that time, I was raising a family. I was also doing a lot of my research. From the early 2000s, I would say a lot of my experience in research kind of started in the basement at MSU. I had talked earlier where it was a display case, and I was reading about boarding school. And all of a sudden, the whole room starts shaking, and the display case starts shaking. And I was like, what is going on? You know, so I grabbed all my books and I left. I walked out of the basement, and I was like, is there an earthquake? And the lady at the front desk was like, no. She was like, what's going on? And I go, I don't know. So I went back down and I looked in a display case, and it was a boarding school display case. And I was learning about Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act that time at MSU. It's Native American Studies program. And so I was like, something's going on. So I was at that level of like that spiritual aspect of something telling me, hey, you know, what you're doing, you know, is probably going in a direction where you're going to learn a lot. But at that time, when I reflect on it, it was like that first sign, right? As I'm learning about it, I graduate, and I sit down probably around 2005 to 2007. And I start talking to my aunts, my uncles, my father, my parents, our grandparents, and I start talking about what does that look like as far as boarding school for them? What was their experience? I don't know if you've ever interviewed anybody who's been through a traumatic experience. And I myself, right, I'm used to all of this research and reading it on books and finding what I could about it. But when it was a personal experience that my parents or my aunts or uncles went through, it was horrific. I wasn't ready for that part of that research. It made it really personal. It made it really spiritual. And it made that connection more real. And it made me realize where I came from and how the history, the political attitude in the nation was at that time. And what really kicked it off for my tribe was Custer's Last Stand. You guys aren't too far from that. After 1876, what had happened for my tribe was after the battle had happened, we had to move out of that area right away. I have all these stories about, I come from a matriarchal tribe. My matriarchal tribe is, the men have 13 societies. The women only have 2 societies in our tribe. A matriarchal tribe is the women have a say and we are equal within our tribe. Because we've watched the wolf, we've watched the buffalo, we've watched thousands of years of evolution in nature to the point where it has sustained our tribal law. When people came here, they said, you know, Native Americans didn't have very much. You know, they didn't know that we had our own tribal government. They didn't know we had our own hierarchy. We had our own chiefs. And for my tribe, there were male chiefs and women chiefs. And when we fought at Custer's Last Stand, a lot of the women fought at that time too. So when you talk about the military, you only see the United States military. When you talk about Custer's Last Stand, you're going to see the last remnants of these tribal people who had their own military system and a matriarchal system. For us, for the women, there's only 2 societies. For men, it's 13. 13 because it takes a man a whole life to become the equal to a woman. A woman is sacred in her life because we bring life to this world. And that's the way I was brought up. That's who I was taught I was from the beginning since I was a little girl. And so I was thought people knew and lived that way also until I came to school here. And it was entirely different. Within that military system, you'll see a lot of how we made decisions and what those decisions were based upon. A lot of research I've done, those parts of tribal aspects aren't written about. You have to be really uniquely connected to the tribe to understand what that is. And in ways that various people will share that information is really important too, but they share it uniquely in different ways. One of the things as I moved on, was really listen to my parents, my grandparents, history, stories, knowledge, but then realizing, like again, they're survivors of all this trauma, and not just boarding school trauma. You know, like I said, Custer's Last Stand. My mom's side was Sand Creek Massacre, so all of these different things were happening to our people. And it wasn't real easy visiting with them, because it would be like, when I was growing up, my aunt and my uncle would come and sit there and they would cry. And I was kind of really always uneasy when they were gonna visit. I'd be like, oh no. You know, and then back in the day, it wasn't like, where if your aunt and uncle come to your house, you have to sit still, you have to sit at the table. If they need something, you get up and you serve them as a kid, and you don't disturb the conversation. So as we're sitting there, they would always start talking in Arapaho, but then they would start crying. And I was like, what is going on? You know, I was always uneasy. And as I got older, I became a teenager, I understood, oh, that's why they were crying. You know, they went through boarding school themselves, but they themselves knew the history of boarding school, and it wasn't always that great. My great-grandfather, Chief Sharpnose, was a really important person during Custer's Last Stand, but after that, in 1881, he took President Arthur to Yellowstone. And when he took him to Yellowstone, 1883, he took him to Yellowstone. In 1881, his oldest son got sent to Carlisle boarding school. And so that history, my aunts and uncles would come to the house and that's what they would talk about. And it wasn't, like I said, very good a lot of the time. A lot of the time in the research, a lot of the elders I interviewed would be like, why are you asking me these questions again? Why are we rehashing a lot of this trauma? A lot of the times it was really personal for them, and some of them wouldn't share it in freely. And at that time, I didn't understand, like, why are they upset? You know, what did I do to upset them? So I would always try to make it better. You know, for outside researchers, I can understand how it is so hard to record that type of history, because I barely was able to pull that history together being related to various relatives. So as we move on, what does that look like, preserving that culture and that history? Like again, I said, every tribe is unique. And really, what does that look like when we do a lot of that research? As you see today, the exhibit here really is that revitalization, that retelling of the history of various tribes. It talks about what did that look like? What did they go through? And I kind of wish that, and sometimes I would bring my dad to various presentations before he passed away. But he would sit there, and he got to the point where I myself had to help him move through that. So one of the things I worked on in 2015 to 2018 was rebringing our children back from Carlisle, Pennsylvania. My great-grandpa, Chief Sharpnose, like I said, had his children taken out, and I forget which one of these is the pointer. Okay, so here, right here is Little Chief, and him, so this is Little Chief, Chief Sharpnose's youngest son, Horse, and Little Plume. All three of these children were buried at Carlisle, Pennsylvania. Growing up, I had this book that my aunt and my uncle had, and it's really thick. It's Trenholm Krober, Arapaho Politics. And the one picture that stood out for me was this picture, because this is them going to school. This was them arriving at the gazebo at Carlisle, Pennsylvania. They went out of their way to take their picture, but throughout the course of the research that I found out was nobody knew what they passed away from. Nobody knew or kept track of various things of what had gone on there, what had happened. And so some of the time, a lot of that information was disheartening. In this picture, a lot of the children did come back. Within this picture, the two boys with the hats are Shoshone, and basically a lot of the children there are Arapaho. They didn't travel there in luxury. They traveled there in cattle cars from the train. And so when they got there, they didn't know where they were going. It was this dark cattle car. Imagine riding a cattle car from here all the way to Pennsylvania. It was cold, it was dark. They didn't get to eat very much food. The other part to that a lot of people don't talk about is when the government decided to take these children, they took a lot of children from chief families. If you can take somebody's children, you're taking basically their livelihood. If you're taking their children, you're taking their future away from them, but you're also taking the tribe's future away from them. At the same time, you're breaking up families, you're breaking up traditional societies and clans, and you're breaking up that system of community. And so when these children left, they were like, why am I being chosen to be taken away? So they were crying. So a lot of that trauma was being relived when I was doing these interviews. A lot of anger was being brought up because why were these kids taken away? And remember that this generation that I'm interviewing are our older generation of tribal people who felt like even if they lived to come back to the reservation, there was no home for them. Because when they left, their families start abusing alcohol, drugs, different addictions. A lot of the land that was allotted to these families, if they didn't have future heirs to them and they died in Carlisle, that land was easily taken away. So land was being affected, water rights were being affected, the use of the land and land management was being affected, housing, social economics. So when you talk about boarding school, it's not just about, oh, these kids got sent away. When you look at the political government policies and laws that were made within that time, it don't benefit any tribal members at all. So as these children are being sent off to boarding school, a lot of the time they would get there. And this picture intrigued me. When I got to Carlisle, I realized the train stops right by the jail. And one of the stories that was shared with me from an elder was that as soon as the train stops, they open the cattle cars, a wagon pulls up, and they get all of their traditional clothing taken away. And as soon as their traditional clothing is taken away, they get military uniforms, various uniforms for various ages. This is gonna matter later in the presentation. But as they get there, the dungeon, the jail is right there by the trail, the train station, the railroad. If they're acting up, and these little kids were from like 2 months to like early 20s. So these children would show up. If you were misbehaving, crying, whatever, you get thrown in the jail. And the jail that I that I saw in Carlisle was this old bunker, this army bunker that was made in the 1700s. And we walked around in there because they changed it into a museum. And I said, somewhere here there's a dungeon. And so we walked around. And pretty much how this floor is, there was a part to it where you could lift it up and you could see the bottom of the ground, and it was dungeon. It was, they said they found old headstones down there. They found child shackles and child handcuffs. And so being in that area and feeling what these children must have felt when they got there was horrific. Reliving that trauma, but finally getting to the point where I realized everything the elders had told me that had happened and they had heard that had happened was true. And so as they showed up to Carlisle, like I said, everything was stripped from them. They weren't behaving, they were put into the jail. And so then they went on to the rest of their livelihood there at Carlisle. When I did the research, a lot of the time the picture that is here is Sharpnose, his wife, and his 2 other children. This is his older son. This is my grandpa. These 2 are brothers, Scott Dewey and Little Chief Dickens Knorr. This poses a problem as far as research, because when we talk about sending these children to boarding school, as I talked about those 13 age grade societies for little boys, their names would change every time they went through age grade society. So when he got sent off, what was his name? We knew his name when he left, but when he got to Carlisle, Pennsylvania, it changed. And so once his name changed and two brothers show up, they both get different last names. That throws a wrench in things. So if that happens to me, imagine how many other students and tribal members that happens to. One of the things about Little Chief, his name got changed to Dickens Noor. Dickens Noor, I have no idea how they came up with that name, but one of the things that one of the things for my dad's dad, who went to school there, I think I could still point him out, is right here. And I'm gonna change sides really quick so I can point at it right. So if you could kind of see the buttons here. In this picture, my grandpa is between 14 and 18. When they get to Carlisle and they get that type of uniform, they have like these little tiny military buttons. I don't know if you've ever seen them, but they have eagles on them. And a lot of those buttons show that they're older boys, just because of their uniform, maybe for them to look a lot more put together and a lot more, sleek. This is important because as I move on with the presentation, we had disinterred one of the children that I had showed you before that had, we had trouble identifying him. And it was the buttons that really determined, along with the osteology of the student, what that looked like. In pictures, you can see a lot of things, and one of the things I learned about at MSU in one of my classes was photography, but also whatever project I worked on was a lot of stories and a lot of pictures. In these pictures, this is the picture of War Chief Sharpnose taking President Arthur in 1883 to Yellowstone, before they call it Yellowstone. President Arthur said, hey, you've been out to Carlisle, we're coming over there, I would love you to be there, to be my scout. We want to call this place and make it a conservation area, and we want to protect it. And so with Little Chief leaving in 1881, and within 1881 and 1883, Chief Sharpnose, along with other delegates, went out to Washington, D.C., had met the president, and so that's how they knew each other. In this picture, this is a family picture that was always up in our house. And I would always, as a little kid, be like, why every time my aunt and uncle come, they see that picture and they cry? And then I realized as I got older, it was because that's in 1883, when the president showed up, my grandpa Sharpnose said, where's my son? How come you didn't bring him with you? And the president told him, he passed away in January, and so I wasn't able to bring him with me. But he is buried there, and they went on with the rest of their day. And so it really upset his mom, Sweetgrass, who is here, and you can tell they're in mourning because they cut their hair. And this, like I said, was a family photo. When my aunt and uncle would come, they would see the picture and just cry. And I was like, at some point, we're gonna have to try to get our relative back. And so within the course of the time, I'm learning all these different laws and all these different policies. This picture was important because of that reason. For us, when we're in mourning, we cut our hair. When we're lively and we are proud of who we are, we let our hair grow long. It represents that connection to the world, but it also represents and shows people that we have all of our people together. Every braid, every intertwining of that braid is that community, that good spirit, that medicine, everything that goes into it is into that hair. And so when we pass away, we cut our hair, and that hair is buried with our relative. Well, they were never given the ability or the opportunity to bury my great uncle. He's buried there in Carlisle since 1883. In 2017, I worked with Arlington Cemetery attorneys to finally start moving forward to get our children back. And it was hard, it was difficult. I was in a position of authority within my tribe where I thought, this needs to happen. The longer I wait, the more we lose a lot of our own. I used to call my dad Ending Google. Here he is right here. This is Ending Google, that's my dad right here. And I would say, I could ask my dad anything. My dad could speak French, he could speak Spanish, he could speak Lakota, he could speak Cheyenne, Shoshone, High Plains Sign Language, Arapaho. And he knew all kinds of languages, and if I wanted to know anything, my dad knew. And my dad passed away in 2018. He was 90 years old, and we would always fight over what year he was born, because they don't even know what year he was born. He fought in Korea War. And one of the things about this delegate of Arapaho, there's Yufna Soldier Wolf, Hubert Friday, Crawford White, and Nelson White. This is Nelson White. This is Bonnie White. And in here is, you see these army-style tents, but right here is the barrier. So we're within the cemetery at that point. Without these elders and their history, sharing their traumas, I literally sat in their houses and cried. We had film crews there who would come and record, not to exploit their trauma or their experiences, but to share that later on with the children of like, this is what they went through, this is how hard it was. I sat in their houses and would just cry hearing about the things that they went through as little kids. And it motivated me, inspired me a whole lot more than it did knowing that, you know, this not only just didn't happen to my parents, it happened to so many parents and grandparents. We're in that generation of acknowledging of what happened to us, preserving that research, preserving who we are, but hopefully revitalizing a healing tribal nation of young people who acknowledge this, but can move on and have better lives. One of the things here with this repatriation disinterment, as much as I went to school for the various things, it made it real when we got there and we started digging for our own relatives. There's this part of trauma that I still have and carry with me that I'm not ready to have closure with just yet, because I feel like I still have something to learn from it. And when I get to that age when I can start learning from it, I can share that information. But as we move forward, that research, like again, as I said, is really important. That those buttons were important because one of the children headstones were misplaced, and we knew that. But the Army, and when you work with different federal agencies, the way that they do their work is different in their process and protocols. So even with other tribes that I've worked with, their process and protocols are different. The way they do things, the way they talk. So in a way, I wore 7 or 8 different hats when we were in Carlisle. This is the cemetery. And as you would go into any cemetery, these are military headstones. So usually military headstones for regular sized people are about as big as this podium. But these headstones there are really small. They were probably half of this, well, maybe the size of this speaker right here. And it was really eerie walking into the cemetery because it hits you that these are just children. These are just children in the cemetery that had been passed away. A lot of the Army War College that it sits on today basically is in an area of Pennsylvania where if you went there, you wouldn't even know that it was a Carlisle Indian Industrial School. You would never know. There's no signs, there's no memorial. There's one little rock, I don't think it's in this picture, other than that sign. And this is the second time they put this cemetery, so they moved it the first time, and then the second time. We did ground penetrating radar with the Army, and we wrote a report which is public, and you can go look at it. However, there are still graves under the parking lot There are various other graves in other areas that they can't account for. Some things are unidentified, and it's so long ago that, you know, sometimes those records aren't even being cared for. A lot of the times, if you can kind of see right here, there's a little cross. When we got our children back, we weren't able to, a lot of the elders didn't want crosses on their military headstones because the boys that got sent out were never really, we never really grieved or processed our own ceremonies in the way we were supposed to. And so there were certain things they wanted in certain ways, which the military honored. In this picture right here, and I was hoping to hit the link, and I probably don't have any time, but if you follow this link, Dickinson College has a link there, and they have the student records, they have various things that you can do a lot of research. When we were doing our research, this wasn't available. I wished it was. I was literally writing letters to Pennsylvania, like snail mail, right? Like 2 months, 3 months later, hoping to get a package of names of the students that went there. This is readily available, it's easy access. You can go in there and Google search Arapaho or Cheyenne or Crow or Blackfeet, whatever you want, and it's gonna bring up the students names that went to school there. Again, you won't see a lot of information. You're lucky if there's pictures. You're lucky if there's any documentation of what they passed away from or where they went or who stayed there or whatnot. And so a lot of that information is there. This in itself was the cemetery, and you can go on there and you can hit the simulation, and it'll actually show you. And this goes really fast. The simulation goes really fast. One of the boys, like I said, had their headstones misplaced. And so Hayes Little Plume Arapaho, who was buried there, was mixed up with an Apache boy. And so we knew that through record, and we knew that through oral histories. We knew that way ahead of time before we even got there. When we start the disinterment, the Army said there's nothing we can do about that. If we find an Apache boy, then we'll know or we won't know. And it was real disheartening to know that, because we were there for our own kids. There were other tribes, and there will be other tribes where they'll never get their children back because they don't want them back. They believe that once they're buried, they're basically already on their own journey. For us, it was different that our children didn't receive the rights that they were supposed to in their ceremony they were supposed to, and so we brought them home. And so with Hayes, even though we brought our kids back in 2017, we had to go back after him in 2018. Again, like I said, these buttons, these uniforms were really important. Does anybody here know what a tintype photograph is? A tintype, okay, so you know that they flake, right, as time goes on? Well, this started flaking, and my dad had this picture in his wallet, and this is his dad. This is his dad, and that's their brothers. This boy and this boy are both brothers. This is the older brother who passed away there. And I would say, Dad, how come you have this in your wallet? I was like, it's a tintype, and it's basically tin, but it's starting to flake off. And I'm like, this is like real important. You shouldn't have it in your wallet. And he was like, this is the only picture I have of my dad when he was a young boy. And I'm like, okay, we need to do something with it. So I've been trying to make copies and digitize what he has, but he also has his diploma from Carlisle. He has various books, he has various photos, he has various things. My grandpa here might have died there, but my other grandpa came back from Carlisle, and he was a councilman. He could read, he could write, he could make budgets, he would go talk to Congress. They did all types of things, but he wouldn't have that knowledge if he didn't go to Carlisle, if he didn't have education. So there's a balance there for me. There's this horrific thing that happened, but there's this other side to it where my other grandpa did come home. He did revitalize and preserve what we did have. So there's those two stories right there. This picture here, I had presentation of, and I'm gonna see if it's on here. I didn't include it. We went to Rosebud, South Dakota, because some of the Lakota there had wanted their children back. And one time when I first started this, I put a little ad in the newspaper. It was like 20 words. And it said, who wants their kids back from Carlisle? I was like, I do. I said, who wants to come to this meeting? It was a little tiny newspaper with like this little ad that I put out for like, I don't know, $10. There's people from all over different states and different tribes calling me. I had people calling me from like DC, and I didn't even know who they were until later on I found out they were real important. I was like, whoa, you know, like it really took off. And all these people came to this meeting I wasn't ready for, and it was a space this big, and there was probably 100 people in there, and I was like, whoa, these people really want their kids back, so do I. So it really kicked off. It really started this thing where we finally were the first nation to get our kids back. Not only that, but Rosebud also got their children back. You may see other tribes not wanting their children back. You may see other tribes not knowing a lot of their own research or their history. Or you may see elders who didn't want to share that information because it was too traumatic. So you'll see different tribes do different things. All tribes do various things differently. This man here, his name is Sonny Trimble, and I work with him really closely. He works for the Army Corps of Engineers, and we did a lot of archaeology, we did a lot of history, we did a lot of our own research. I felt like I stayed there for nearly a month and a half, working with them to get our children back. But within that time, I really got to know him and his crew. I got to really work with them and felt really reciprocated in the ideas that they would respect us in ways that are tribally, culturally sensitive. That these are our relatives. It's not just somebody we're, you know, we didn't know. This was my great uncle, right? Their families were there, so it was this huge thing. We did make a documentary, and it's called Home from School. Home from School was on PBS. It was being streamed a while ago, probably before COVID hit. And so I was a part of that documentary. And being a part of that, I told these old guys, because they're all of our ceremonial men, and I told them, I don't want to do the filming. And I thought they were gonna be like, we agree. They were like, we need to do this film. If we don't do this film, our story's gonna be lost. If we don't do this film, people will never know this story. If we don't do this film, that research and the history will be gone. And so there I was with a camera in my face for a month and a half. And it was real difficult because I was like, this is like the biggest thing. Imagine your biggest thing that's ever happened to you in your life, and there's a camera in your face, and you don't know if there's gonna be a mistake happening, and there were mistakes. There were things that could have been better. There were times we cried. There were times we were happy, and it was all there in the documentary, and it was real hard. It was hard for me to watch, but it was really more difficult when I lost a lot of these elders, including my dad. Before we went to Carlisle to get our children back, not only did it take a lot of this research, but it took acknowledging that this trauma happened and that we need to heal from it. So I'm hoping we're in this age of reconciliation. I'm hoping this is what this exhibit is bringing, is that phase of reconciliation. Growing up, I was always taught we were proud people, that alcohol and drugs were never who we were. But a lot of what happened in our history through policies is what impacted us to be the way we are today. And I solely have lived that. I'm that product of it myself. And so as I move into learning my history, I not only learned about myself, but learned how to do the research and to put it into a process where we actually got our children back, which was huge. A lot of my elders here, I had to have a training called Mending Broken Hearts. Mending Broken Hearts is a 3-day trauma-informed, well-done type of training where you're just sitting there like this and you're talking, but you go into smaller groups and you're talking, but you have elders in this group who actually talk about their traumas, talk about what happened to them at boarding school. And it helps you as a young person because you realize, I realized for myself that school wasn't that hard for me. School was really hard for them. And as you go through that and you move through that, it really helps bring closure. I couldn't take these elders all the way from Wyoming to Pennsylvania and then have them get sick there because they didn't deal with their trauma. They didn't have closure. So when we got there, they all needed medicine. They all needed, different things for a whole week and a half, for almost a month and a half, to where I was like, I can't get you there and have you get sick on me. We need to deal with this right now. And when we get there, it makes us stronger. We can do what we need to do, and we can come home and have our closure. And we did. My dad is no longer here, and neither is my cousin Crawford. A lot of the times what they dealt with was differently, but this era, my dad went to Korea, the other men went to Vietnam. I want to share with you really quick my dad's story. My dad went to boarding school, St. Stephen's Indian boarding school, Catholic. He went to school there, ran away from there, had horrific things happen to him there, abuse after abuse from nuns, from fathers. He would run away from school. His own uncle hit him so hard that he busted his eardrum. And so his grandma, fighting at Custer's Last Stand, approached her brother and said, the next time I find you beating up my grandson, she said, you're no longer gonna be here. And so that set the stage, and they never bothered my dad again. But he went from graduating from that boarding school to going to Haskell, which is a university now, to getting to that boarding school. He ran away from Haskell. I don't know if you guys know where Kansas City is, or Haskell, or Hays, Kansas. It's a long ways from Wyoming. He said he hoboed and caught the train all the way back to Wyoming, and he would only travel at night. And he said that when they went there on a cattle car too, nothing luxurious. There they are. I'm kidding. One of the things about that was when he did finally get home, he was like, yeah, I made it. I finally made it. I'm home. I'm of age. I can stay home. I can take care of my grandma and my grandpa. He said the next day he woke up and heard a knock at the door. And he was like, oh, they found me. He went and opened the door, and his grandma let in his uncles. And his uncles told him, get ready, you're drafted and you're going into the Korean War. So he was put into the Marines. He said he didn't get a chance to pick that time. You just got drafted. And so he went from boarding school to boarding school to boarding school to being drafted and going to the Korean War, getting injured, going back, and then coming home again. And so he was to the point where in his older life where the allotted land he was given was taken away by the Wyoming state for eminent domain. And so he had to go buy his own piece of land to live and raise his family. And so, his whole life was this cycle of toxicity and negativity, to the point where he was like, we did Mending Broken Hearts, and he was like, I understand now. He said, my whole life I wanted to be accepted. He said, my whole life I tried really hard to do the things that I was supposed to do, but I realized that wasn't for me, and that's okay, but I lived through it. I'm still here. And so my dad passed away when he was 90, and that's him. This is a picture of us finally bringing my great uncle back. Like I said, women have 2 societies, men have 13, and we still practice that today. We're a matriarchal tribe. To bring back my great uncle was huge. To bring back these other boys was huge. In my mind, I worked on it for so long. I've done so much history. I've done so much for it that I feel like sometimes I'll wake up in the morning and be like, oh, we got to work on this again. And then I'm like, we're done. We're done. And it's real hard sometimes because I'm like, what am I going to work on now? I went to school for just about everything. I wanted to really share, I don't know how many more minutes we have. I wanted to share best practice. Okay, and then it should be enough time I'm going to cruise through this, so if you guys have questions, you can ask. But I was brought to this roundtable in Minnesota, and they said, how can you put together what you went through with this research and all this other stuff to the point where you can help other tribes? And I think since that time, there's been 8 to 11 that are getting their children back. But it was best practices one of the things I said was pace yourself. If you do go, don't wear multiple hats, because I did and I was tired. I had the Army knocking on my door like 2 o'clock in the morning, and I'm like, okay, what are we doing now, you know? So pace yourself, do your homework, do your research. There will be obstacles, generate information, complete affidavits. So that was another thing. A lot of the times people wanted it to be NAGPRA, but the Army doesn't have NAGPRA. Even though they repatriate from other countries, they don't have NAGPRA. They have disinterments, reinterments. So we had to negotiate that process. So I was telling tribes, complete that information. And Indian time there is like, you're 4 hours ahead, I think, in Pennsylvania. And so like, they're 4 hours ahead, you'll be 4 hours behind. And so talking about that was really important. But also that with military, they're so punctual. You have to be there at a certain time, do all these certain things. So a lot of the times it was really always negotiating. Purchase your travel tickets, call to the airport. One of the other things was that a lot of things we want to do ceremony with, like TSA was like, you ain't getting on the plane with that. And we were like, oh yeah, we are. And so it was this huge argument every time, especially with the elders. You saw them with their feathers on. We had to fly from Wyoming to Pennsylvania. So TSA was another thing for me, along with a lot of the oxygen that they had to carry on and all of this other stuff. So take time. One of the things that the military thought, we wanted to make a little fire in this little skillet. Well, the military thought we were gonna have this huge bonfire, right? So they were like, we're stacking up all this wood. I'm like, what for? And they were like, you wanted a fire. And I was like, no, we just need the charcoal thingies. We don't need to make this huge bonfire. So yeah, perspective is different. Being insightful is really important, but communication is also important. The other thing is assign someone. Like I said, if you know and have gone to school for that type of thing, it's great if you have somebody with them. Media was huge. Having a spokesperson is huge, because I had to do all of it myself, and I didn't know at that time. Even media is huge. And then one of the last things was just saying that Hayes did come home in 2018. And then last year we finally got one child that went during, who went to Fort, so there was a fight before Sand Creek, right? And there was Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Lakota, and Apache, like Geronimo. They got sent to Florida, the prison there. Some of those students, the younger ones, some of those warriors that were in prison got sent to Carlisle. And so we had one Arapaho boy who died before all of these boys and was buried there. We finally got him back last year. We couldn't claim him because we had not had the ability to do the affidavit. So within that time, the military said, yeah, go ahead and you can get your child back. But that is basically it. I wanted to stop right there and say thank you, but also if anybody has questions, anybody has anything they want to ask, right now is a great time. Thank you. I hope, yes.
You said that NAGPRA wasn't applicable to reclaim the bodies. Why not?
So yes, so NAGPRA, for everybody that doesn't know, it's Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, which was passed in 1990, actually November 16th, my birthday. So one of the reasons why NAGPRA wasn't applicable was because the Army, if you ever work with federal agencies or worked with federal agencies, the Forest Service does NAGPRA differently. The transportation does it differently. NHPA does it differently. What I'm saying is that it's the same act, but the process that they follow is differently. So not every federal agency does practice NAGPRA, but since Arlington Cemetery and the area that we're talking about, they never had that process. They repatriate from other countries all the time. When we go to war, and this was one of my points, we go to war a lot in other countries and we bring back those soldiers. Our own people have passed away here. You need to find a process and you need to figure out what that looks like, because it's not my responsibility to do that. It's the Army's responsibility. And so they had to come up with the budget, they had to come up with the process, they had to come up with protocols in order to initiate the disinterment for our children. Legally, they don't follow NAGPRA. Legally, they have their own processes and protocols in DC. I don't work there, I can't really speak or say anything on their behalf, but that's the process I had to go through with them. NAGPRA, I had reached out earlier to NARF, Native American Rights Fund, and asked them, can you help us? Can you help me get my kids back? And they were like, we're sorry, you're never gonna see your kids. And I was like, that's not gonna stop me. You know, I'm still gonna move forward and do what I need to do. So I think the lesson from that overall was don't let things stop you, but at the same time, it's the government's responsibility for them to be held accountable, but for them to come up with a process, whether it's NAGPRA or not, they had to follow a process and come up with their own protocols to ensure that we got our children back. And in a way, that was holding them accountable, but also telling them, you need to put money behind this, because you can talk all you want about it, but until you put a budget and you start saying you're gonna do this, then we'll actually see it happen, and we did. I hope that answers your question in a weird way, but yeah. Does anybody else have questions?
Has it helped the healing, having the children back?
I think it has. I see a lot more people going to Mending Broken Hearts. It's a huge community type of thing for people to go. They have it every other month. And I'm starting to see that in data. I'm starting to see that in numbers. I'm starting to see it with people who are addicted to drugs and alcohol. I'm hoping that the youth of our generation that don't have to live those toxic cycles and break that trauma aren't living that way in the future. The ones that are still dealing with it, you still see them abusing that every day. But I'm hoping to see a huge change. I'm seeing a change in a lot more children graduating. I'm seeing a lot more children going off to school and seeing it as a benefit for them to empower themselves. And I'm hoping that that continues in the future. That was my biggest thing, was having a healthy youth, because we don't have a future as a tribe if we don't have the health of our people. You had a question?
Yeah, were there only boys taking the Carlisle?
No, I was gonna say that Little Chief, they did have an older sister and she ran away. She ran away so far. I don't know if you've ever been to, Minnesota. So Pennsylvania to Minnesota. She ran away with 2 other girls. And we talk about missing murdered Indigenous women or people a lot. Well, she was the first one to run away from our family, never told anybody that she was alive. They automatically assumed she passed away. And sometime wrote a letter to her brother Scott, my dad's dad, and told him, oh, guess what, I'm alive. And see, this all hush hush, this research, everything we've done, if the government found out you were talking about it, you're automatically in trouble. You're not getting rations, we could throw you in jail. If you're a pregnant woman, you'll probably lose your baby in there. There's horrific things done to people in jail. So all these things come up, and so she never told nobody she was alive. She ran away from school. A lot of things were like that happening. Physical and sexual abuse was happening at these schools. So a lot of them have buried babies at the cemeteries. Priests were having babies with the nuns and the students. And so that was like hush hush, covered up. If you talk about it, you go to jail. So a lot of that secrecy is called a code of silence. And a lot of that, the healing of our communities, is finally coming out. People are finally realizing, oh, that person was, their father was actually the father at the church. And so that's why he looks differently, and that's why he's treated differently. And people at that time knew that he was, you know, the father's actual father, dad. So you have types of things like that that come out, and a lot of these girls would run away from the school. And so you see in photos, a lot of them are just boys. So that was another part of the research that was pretty traumatizing. Anybody else have any more questions? Yes?
Did they change the children's names? Did they Americanize their names?
Yes, so that was in my presentation. Dickens Noor, his name got changed to Dickens Noor. We don't know why. His brother's name got changed to Scott Dewey. You would never know they were related if because their last names don't match. the same with their sister. And so when they get there, you look through school records, you would never know they were siblings unless they went there together. They didn't. Their names changed. So when you talk about research, you really got to dig deep, look at tribal protocol, tribal processes, tribal, however they receive their name, and then figure out what it was changed to. And that in itself was a lot of work. That in itself was research after research, and sitting down with elders and talking to them about what is that name changed to, what is it going to be, how do you write that today, and what does that mean? So for us, names are huge. Names aren't just given, for any reason. We didn't have last names a long time ago. We only had one name, and if that name changed over the course of that time, somebody else could have had that name, a generation or two ago. So names are huge. Research for names for different tribes are uniquely their own, but it's really important to know when you're wanting to do something like that. Yes?
Have you used any DNA? Like there's,
That's
the
a
male
really good
DNA,
question.
there's the, since you're a matriarchal society, the mitochondrial DNA.
So DNA was a really good question. We were asked, do you want to do DNA? And our elders, they're so spiritually driven that they were like, no, we don't need to do DNA. They said once we know they're there and they're going to want to come home, they're going to come home and they're going to be identified. So their belief and their confidence and trusting the Creator, knowing that those are their children, was real deep. I mean, like 100%. But there have been tribes that want to do DNA, and you see problems with DNA because as tribal people, we're so much exploited and appropriated that a lot of people can claim their native descendancy through different things. But one thing that had happened is, where Copenhagen is, right? So they're the main place that do a lot of the DNA. It's changed since this time, but at some point, the people who just hold that DNA can exploit or use for different things. And our elders at that time were like, we don't trust a lot of people who hold our data. There's this thing called data sovereignty, and they were like, we don't trust that process. Anybody can, clone or do whatever they want with that DNA and then possibly use it back towards us in a way that negatively impacts us. And so DNA is huge. It's something that is a great tool, but I've gone to school and have studied DNA, and I feel like for the tribes it does work for, I think they should use it. But for the tribes that don't believe in that, it's great that we respect what they want to do. So there's a balance there. You see that balance. And the great thing is the Army is willing to respect those wishes. That's a great question. Anybody else? Yes?
Of the thousands of kids that went to Carlisle, is it true that less than 200 actually graduated along with your grandfather?
Yes. So So the question was, with as many kids that went to school, there's a very few that graduated. It's true. A lot of them left there with trade. When they graduated from high school, it was 5th and 6th grade level. It wasn't high school like we get our children ready for college. So it's 5th grade, 6th grade level. You can read, write, and do math. But when they graduated, they would try to keep them there because some of them didn't have children, homes to go back to. So a lot of the students and the staff that work there on campus were the students that did graduate. And if they got a trade, they'd go into Pittsburgh or New York or wherever and work. None of them would ever go home. But it is true that very few of them graduated because of very few of them either passed away or they ran away or they just weren't finishing school. And the retention rate wasn't that great, right? But 5th grade, 6th grade level, you're saying you're graduating and you're ready for, the world at that time. And at that time, the Spanish flu hit too. The Spanish flu hit the time my dad's dad was working in Pittsburgh. He was a carpenter. And his thing was like, they actually have letters of him writing home like, hey, superintendent in Wind River, can I come home now? And he was like 17, 18. And the superintendent was like, no, you're fine. Your grandpa passed away, but your grandma's still working the farm by herself. She's doing great. And it was like, okay, So yeah, I mean, it's true that a lot of the kids that went to school there, they weren't graduating, and a lot of them were not even going home after that point. So education too has changed. When we talk about boarding school, we talk about how healthcare is important, how upholding treaties that talk about healthcare and education is important. But in the end, what are the impacts to the land today, and what does that look like? So there's huge questions that are coming out of boarding school, and what does that all look like when we talk about this research? Anybody else have any questions? I don't know how much more time we have.
We're about done. So
Okay,
thank you so
great.
much.
Well, I